Hello, and welcome to the beginning of Chapter 17. Chapter 17 is all about Reconstruction and its aftermath. Its aftermath. So, what happens after the Civil War? What happens when Robert E. Lee surrenders to Grant and the war is over? That's what this chapter is all about. So, after the Civil War, the period of time in which the South is rebuilt is called Reconstruction. Um, you'll hear this term used throughout any American history class that you take now in high school or in college, Reconstruction. So the big question was, how is this going to happen? What is it going to look like? Should people who own slaves, should they be punished? Should they be forgiven? What rights do these newly freed slaves get? Men, women. There was a lot of debate as to how this was going to happen. I mean, you have to remember that the South really had been destroyed. Sherman destroyed a good part of his South with his total war plan. And so there were a lot of problems in the South. Most of the major fighting had taken place in the South. Towns, cities, they were in ruins. Plantations had been burned. Roads, bridges, railroads destroyed. Not only that, but you have over 250,000 Confederate soldiers had been killed, or they came back sick or wounded. And so families had to rebuild their lives with basically few adult males. People in the nation, they all agreed that the Southern economy and society had to be rebuilt, but the big question is how they were going to do it. And so we have three different points of view as to how to rebuild the South. The first point of view that we're going to look at is Lincoln. Lincoln had his own plan for how to rebuild the South. It was called the 10% plan. Now, what's really interesting is that Lincoln offered this first plan for accepting Southern states back into the Union as early as 1863. Now, this is 2 years before the war was over, but it's called planning ahead. And so he had his own plan, and it became known as the 10% plan because that was basically the standard that he was looking at. And so what did his plan look like? Well, he wanted 10% of the voters of a state to take an oath of loyalty to the Union. And when that happened, the state would then form a new government, a new state government. They would write a new state constitution that would include banning slavery. And he basically wanted the people of a southern state who supported the Union to take charge of the state government. He didn't think that punishing the South was or served any purpose. He felt that they had been punished enough. The war was punishing in and of itself. And so it served no useful purpose, and it only delayed healing. And President Lincoln was a president of healing, and we're going to see that, not just for the people of the South, but for the slaves as well. President Lincoln offered something called amnesty to all white Southerners who were willing to swear loyalty to the Union, except for those high-ranking Confederate leaders. So amnesty is the same thing as a pardon. To be pardoned means to be forgiven. So under Lincoln's plan, he wanted to pardon everyone except those Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis types. No punishment at all. But probably more important is that Lincoln wanted to give rights to African Americans, especially those who served in the Union Army. He wanted to give them the right to vote. Now, this was a big sticking point to a lot of people. They did not want to give rights immediately to African Americans, but Lincoln was a supporter of helping the African Americans, and we're going to see how he does that in a minute. Okay, so there are 3 states, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. They actually established governments under Lincoln's plan, that 10% plan, in 1864. Now you might be wondering, or at least I hope you're wondering, how could he do that? The war wasn't over yet. But by 1864, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, they they were already under control of the Union Army. They were occupied by Union Army because remember these are quote unquote Western states, and Ulysses S. Grant had done such a good job with the western part of the campaign that those three states were under Union occupation, and so they did follow Lincoln's plan. They basically were trying to get back into the Union before the war was over. All right, so a group of Republicans in Congress, though, they thought Lincoln's plan was too weak. They thought that 10% wasn't a not high enough number. We have 10% saying, yeah, we support the Union and we swear loyalty. What about the other 90%? What if you had 90% that were against it? And they thought it was just too mild, that it wasn't strong enough, that it didn't have a high enough threshold. And so this group of Republicans, they were known as radical Republicans because their idea was radical compared to Lincoln's. They were in control of Congress, and they felt that Congress should control Reconstruction and not the president or President Lincoln. And so their approach is a little bit tougher. So they wanted to break up Southern institutions, and with their plan, you're going to see it has a name. Um, they really didn't want those states like Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee, who under Lincoln's plan had formed new governments. They didn't want to accept them into Congress. And that's basically how a state comes back into the Union, is that they're given representation in the federal government, because they don't physically come back into the Union, right? You can't pick up a whole state and move it somewhere. So the radical Republicans' plan was called the Wade-Davis Bill. The Wade-Davis Bill. And so this is what their plan looked like. They wanted a majority of white males to swear loyalty to the Union, not Lincoln's 10%. They wanted a majority, which would be 51%, right? Not 10%. Now, what is the big difference there besides the number? Lincoln set his bar lower because he wanted healing and states coming back into the Union to happen quicker. It would take longer to get 50% of white males to swear loyalty to the Union. So it would take longer to find that many. And so that's one of the big parts of the debate. All right, so back to the Wade-Davis Bill. Only white males who swore they had never fought against the Union could vote for people to run the state convention, which would basically create a new government for these southern states. And former Confederates were denied the right to hold public office. So if you were a Confederate, you could not be voted into any kind of office in your state. That leaves a few people, you know what I mean? And so if a new state constitution abolished slavery was adopted at a convention, then that state could be readmitted into the Union. So that part they had in common. Both Lincoln and the radical Republicans did want southern states to create new constitutions which basically abolish slavery in that state. Now, Lincoln refused to sign the Wade-Davis Bill. His plan was too soft. Their plan was too hard. So he knew that he was going to have to find some kind of common ground with these radical Republicans. All right. So one thing, though, that radical Republicans and Lincoln had in common was the idea that African Americans needed help. Now, during this time, the freed slaves, they were given a new term. They were called freedmen, the freedmen. And so with Lincoln's help and Congress, they created a new government agency called the Freedmen's Bureau. It was basically established to help former slaves. Think about 3 million slaves all of a sudden being free. They had been living with their slave holders. Where are they going to get food and money and clothes and medical services? They have nowhere to go. They're going to need schools. And so the Freedmen's Bureau provided a great service to these new freed men. It distributed food. It distributed clothing. It provided medical services. Schools staffed by mostly teachers from the North. It helped African Americans buy land, find land, get jobs, receive fair wages. And one of the lasting effects of the Freedmen's Bureau is historically black colleges and universities come out of the Freedmen's Bureau. It gave way to institutions of higher learning like Howard University, Fisk University, Atlanta, University. Grambling would be one. Bethune-Cookman College in Daytona. All of these are examples of institutions of higher learning that come out of the Freedmen's Bureau. So that is another thing that the radical Republicans and Lincoln, they agree upon. But this debate is going to be for nothing because in the next part, we're going to talk about how Lincoln's assassination really throws a big monkey wrench into all of these plans, and it really kind of upsets the apple cart. So you get to hear about that tomorrow. All right, thanks for coming to my TED Talk. See you tomorrow.